Once again, I'm Dan Bolton with Stir Magazine. Thanks for hanging out for part 2 of the coffee discussion today. We have with us Maja Wallengren, and you know what, if I'm right, it's 46 countries now, right?
It is actually.
Yeah, her bio said 40, but that was last week, and she's already seen 6 countries since then, so she has a lovely blog and also a long and wonderful bibliography of articles and work that she's done for many different publications. It's my pleasure to introduce you today as one of our speakers.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be here in Hamburg. It's such a great coffee town in a great coffee country. So first of all, just a very quick thanks to the organizers of COTECA. It's an honor to be here, and I'm very happy to be able to share some of my views, which tend to be a little bit different from many others in the trade. I hope I can bring a little bit of insight and background that may be new to you. And I have no fear of questions or critiques, so please don't hold any comments back when you are done. So the global coffee market, as we have seen in this last year especially, we are going through very, very turbulent times. So I'm going to go straight to the core and look at a couple of the issues which have been going on in the last year. The one thing that is going on in the market, and that has changed significantly in the last 2 years, is that the market takes a lot longer before it reacts to any kind of news. And grocers have learned to live with a lot less stocks than they used to. So that means until there's evidence of any significant change in the supply-demand balance, you're not actually seeing much reaction in the market. That came this year in January when a lot of new forecasts started coming out from Brazil, and the evidence was started to show up that we were not going to have as big a crop as expected. As we also have seen with climate, we are having increasingly more domination of La Niña in general. That means more rain, less sun exposure, colder weather. That is not good for coffee production, because with less sun exposure, the trees cannot yield as much as they can when you have sun. Except in Africa, where we're seeing a little bit more rain that is actually helping production in these countries. Brazil being opposite, as we have seen this year and last year, more prevalent droughts, because they have much more El Niño presence. And then, of course, thanks to climate change, that is a very hot topic these days. At any given time, even if we are in a cycle with domination of La Niña, we are still seeing unseasonal El Niño or La Niña presence. And that is exactly what is now happening in the last 2 months in Central America, where although we are in a cycle dominated by La Niña, we suddenly have an El Niño, and you have 2.8 million people on food aid because of a drought. On top of that, what we also have seen, and I have been a strong advocate of that in the last 2 years, saying that Vietnam and Brazil figures would have to come back, that the figures and productions simply were not as high as a lot of people in the trade have insisted for the last 2 years. That has happened now, and we are seeing the results in the market. Where are prices headed right now? Are we in a new range? A very topical question. I think it's definitely safe to say that with the increasing reports coming out of Brazil confirming problems, we are looking at a range at probably minimum around $1.80, and we will see the spikes back up over $2, depending on when and where and how much information will come out of Brazil. In times of crisis, the world is drinking more coffee than ever. Imagine, when we started this crisis, this last round of economic crisis in 2009, there were a lot of analysts in the trade who said coffee consumption will definitely suffer. All luxury products will suffer. Not so with coffee. Who is going to go into a crisis meeting with the board of directors and try to figure out what to do about economic crisis and not have coffee? Please. That's not going to happen, and we all know that. So actually what has happened instead is that people are drinking more coffee than ever before, and what happens here This is one professor who has been doing a lot of research on commodity prices and what really happens. This is very interesting. Price spikes only occurs when stocks use ratios and minimal and market is fragile. They do not match market shocks due to storage, but match times of low stocks, not production. We are going to come back to that one. That's why I'm bringing it up right here, because I want to take a close look at that, because that's a very, very interesting baseline for what is happening in the market these last 8-10 months. Drop by drop, bean by bean, is the world running out of coffee? The Brazil drought has basically spearheaded that sort of final trigger in prices to make that happen. But these issues have been going on for several years, many years actually, but especially in the last 10 years we've seen precariously severe problem at the level of origin that has made it impossible for most producing countries to get their crops back on track. Brazil is the largest trigger, obviously being the biggest. It's also where we always will see an immediate impact on the market. Demand is growing phenomenally. We have not seen any other product, especially not in the luxury goods segments, with such absolutely impressive growth as we're seeing in coffee. From 2000 to 2010, coffee consumption worldwide grew at an average 2.4% per year. In the last 5 years, we have seen that continuing at an average 2.1%, which is still very strong. No doubt that most of that growth comes from not traditional markets, but from emerging markets and producing countries. But it's interesting to notice that even in traditional markets, the US, European Union, Japan, we are still seeing minimum growth at between 1.3 and 1.5%. At the rates and volumes we're talking about today, that alone is an increase every year of at least 2.5 million bags. But because of the additional increase from other markets, we are seeing currently the world coffee market expanding by 3 to 3.5 million bags every year. That is a huge amount of coffee. It is the equivalent of the entire production of Guatemala that we need in new coffee every single year. That is where the underlying major issue is at stake for the coffee industry at large today. As we heard from our wonderful speaker from Rabobank, it is increasingly visible that we have real supply fears, and there's no easy or quick fix to that balance, to correcting that balance. So when we're looking at that, let me see if this works, yeah. If we just have the conservative growth at 1.5%, we are still looking at adding 10 to 12 million bags in the next 6 years alone. If we continue to grow at the current rate, in the next 6 years, we will need 18 to 20 million bags of more coffee. That is a huge amount of coffee at any rate. So how are we going to get to that? And why have we not even seen that happening in these last few years? Looking a little further ahead and looking at different scenarios, we could look at the 1.5% scenario, the 2.1. More likely it will be somewhere in the middle range, depending on exactly how fast growth will be. It's very likely to predict that we will continue to grow at between around 2.1, 2.2% in the next 5 to 10 years, and then we gradually may slow down to 1.5% by 2030. We are 15 years ahead that. That sounds like a long, long way ahead to many people, but we need to take that into account, because a coffee tree and planting a new coffee tree will take 5 years before we see that production. By all accounts, we are going to get to needing around 200 million bags by 2030. That is a lot of coffee, and we need to start thinking seriously about how we're going to get to that. What is going on in this current cycle, which we're just about to start in a couple of days? Ever since the export quota and minimum prices came to an end 25 years ago, volatility has become the name of the game. We have seen volatility as level as we had never imagined could happen. That happens both because of the coffee market itself, it happens because of outside influences that we simply do not have a way to control. That 10 years ago, nobody thought that issues going on in China or Russia could affect coffee prices. Today, they are. The global coffee market is going through one of the most significant series of trading patterns. We have for many years during the 80s and 90s seen forecasting models being based on the MBA analysis. I don't believe that is working anymore because it does not take into account the socio-economic issues at stake in producing countries. We have seen multiple reports of weather. We have had issues of weather reports coming in the last 2 to 3 years. There will be significant damage in Vietnam, there will be this damage in Indonesia, there will be flooding here, there will be drought there, pests, crop pests from Africa to Southeast Asia, across Latin America. All of this is actually happening, and all of these reports have come back and confirmed that with one single exemption, being Colombia, every single producing country is at the moment suffering one or different or multiple degrees of negative weather impact. Consumption continues to grow. That is a big source of optimism and reason for why there's a lot to fight for the industry. But why do we not have the coffee? Now, if we look 10 years back, when we had the big crisis between 2001 and 2003, we can see of all these different zones, the only one that has started to come back a few years back was pretty much East Africa. In large thanks to new production from Ethiopia, a little bit from Tanzania. But what has come in new production in Tanzania and Ethiopia has largely been offset by lost production in Kenya, where a lot of coffee land has gone out of production, as well as in other countries. Colombia is another country that just this year is finally back on production after having suffered a tremendous decline. For over 5 years we saw production cut by 40%, and now we're getting back to the levels of 11.5, 12 million bags where Colombia used to be. Mexico, same thing, lost a lot of production, failed to recover altogether. Yes, we have seen 1 or 2 million bags coming back from production in Colombia. We have seen some production coming from new areas in Honduras and Peru. Most of that new production, unfortunately, has been neutralized by the offset of the rust crisis. So overall, in the mild rust supplies, we still have a deficit of 5 million bags compared to 10 years ago. Even with all the new incentives of new production and new plantings in so many countries that should have yielded 5 million bags more in coffee, we today have 5 million bags less than we had 10 years ago. That is the harsh reality of where we are. Why is world production not recovering? There are a number of myths that you always hear in the market. Oh, the market will correct itself. That used to be the saying around the crisis in 2001, 2003. Meaning, we have high prices, everybody plant coffee, then we'll have more production, prices will go down, sooner or later the balance will more or less even out. Well, the market can only correct itself if the conditions are there for that to happen. And they are not any longer, thanks to enlarged overpopulation and too many people on too little land. Producers will renovate and invest in the farms with high prices, right? Hey, we had $3 a pound in most of 2010 and 11. That should have been a bounty of investment and money for all these producers across the world. Guess what? Didn't happen. Now, it didn't happen either 20 years ago when all these farmers had 5 hectares of land. 10 years ago, then they had about 2 hectares of land. Today, most of them have between half a hectare or 1 hectare of land. Producers have never renovated and invested in their farms. Smallholder producers, that is. But they represent between 90 and 92% of all the world's producers. Why? Because when prices are low, the argument is we cannot possibly afford to take out one single tree of production because we need all the money we can get. And when prices are high, we can't do it either because now we need all the extra money we can get because of all the years we didn't have high prices. So they didn't renovate at 5 hectares, they didn't renovate at 2 hectares, and they're most certainly not renovating today either. Brazil can just increase production, right? Brazil can grow 10 million bags of new coffee at any time if they want to. Yeah, in principle, that is true. They do have the land, they can find the money, but what is the cost of that? I talked to a number of farmers and producer associations in Brazil to come up with a calculation. Actually, the cost of growing and planting 10 million bags worth of new coffee in Brazil is $6.7 billion. Even if anyone had that amount of money, they're not going to invest that into coffee, maybe a fraction of it. But the bottom line is, any significant source of new coffee is going to have to come from renovation, reactivating land with higher density, better practices, and better productivity. Climate change is the defining issue of our age. That was what Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, said yesterday evening, at the evening of the big climate summit in New York. It is encouraging to see that a lot of people in the world are actually starting to take this seriously. It is sad that we have lost over 10 to 15 years in coffee not doing more about it, because that has certainly not helped the situation of coffee plantations. Major challenges remain. Financing, credit, the outside market fluctuations, currency devaluations in producer countries, all of this can at any given time cause producers to either sell prematurely or not. All of that can impact the market. Increasing impact of worsening socio-economic conditions. That is, I believe, the #1 fundamental that we have to look much more carefully and closely at. And that is the one issue that has been and is still largely ignored by the market. We have rapidly growing poverty, primarily because of overpopulation in terms of the land size per family unit available for farming today. Climate change continues to make things worse. One of the many issues I've been working on for several years with my independent research has been working with a number of top climate agronomists and looking at what kind of forecasting can you actually use with climate. And I said, can we work on a model, which I was looking at, where we at any given time, at the start of a cycle, basically take off 5% of the forecast due to what we know today will be one or different or multiple effects of climate. And he said, that is way too conservative. We believe we're looking at minimum 10%. Well, I like to go with the conservative, to go to the market and say, okay, you believe we're going to have 35 million bags in Vietnam, or 60 or 70 million bags in Brazil. That's great. Let's work with that. And I will still show you why we're not going to get enough coffee. Between 70 and 75% of all the land cultivated with coffee today in the world is in a state of fully or semi-abandonment. That is the #1 reason why we're not seeing coffee production recovering. Here we get to a very important figure in social science, economics, diminishing returns. What did we see 10 years ago in the crisis? 10 years ago, an average producer actually in the world had 1.3 hectares of land, and we still had an average yield of 10 to 14 quintals, that is 100-pound bags, of coffee per hectare. 10 years later, the land has been cut in half because of divisions in between family members. So already an average coffee producer family has lost half of his income from less land, but because of poor practices, low prices, and the issue of climate, productivity has also been reduced to an average of 5 to 7 quintals. In many producing countries, I'm actually told that I'm being way too optimistic, because we're talking about as little as 2 or 3 quintals bags per hectare. That leads us to a very easy math in terms of income per family. Even when prices were at $3 per pound, an average producer could, in most cases, not make more than $500 from his entire crop. Is he going to invest that money back into the farm? Of course not, because he doesn't even have money enough to put a decent meal on the table for his family per day. Even less to think about coffee, which is why the land is being abandoned. Because producers do not have the luxury and privilege to prioritize coffee farming anymore. They will go and pick up a casual job in a construction plant or in the city or whatever they can to get some money on the table. And then after a few months, after a few weeks, they will go back to the farm, pick up, do a little bit work, what they can do, but obviously that is not going to yield great productivity at the farming level. And that is exactly what is happening at between 70 and 75% of all the coffee land in the world. What is going on with stocks and consumption? Now, my figures for 2012-13, 13-14 are a bit lower than many others in the trade. I do feel very good about my figures, and I don't believe that we've had a surplus production for the last 8 years. We have a couple of years where, depending on where you put Brazil and Vietnam figures, it could have been a bit higher. I don't see that. I haven't seen the evidence for that in the market either. In terms of the reaction, you don't see it in the stocks. We will look a little bit more on that. But basically, when we look at where consumption is compared to demand, we have in the last 7 years drawn 51 million bags of stocks to meet demand. Despite 2 big Brazil crops between 2010 and 2012, world production continued to trail demand. Ongoing supply woes will be headed for the 8th deficit year, this now starting 2014-15 crop, and we will add another 10 million bags to coffee that will be drawn from the existing stocks. Stocks is a big issue. We'll never know for sure how many stocks there is in the world of coffee. What we do know is that the only stocks we can rely on, that grocers and importers can rely on, is the ready available stocks held in importing countries. That is at the moment at about 17 million bags. If we have to take another 10 from them, well, then we will be back down to 2 or 3 weeks of actual supply needed. What is happening with the whole stock issue? Well, US green stocks are currently at about 6 million bags. They have risen a little bit in the last 6 months. European stocks are about 11 versus 8.5 million bags in February. Certified stocks at the ICE exchange in the US has in the last 2 years increased about 0.7 million bags. But overall, total stocks are largely unchanged, currently at 17 million bags versus 15 million bags a year ago. What does that tell us? If we had had these huge crops that some people in the trade like to try to convince me we have had from Vietnam and Brazil and other countries, I'm sorry, where are all these stocks? Show me the secret warehouses with millions of bags held in Brazil and Vietnam or Indonesia, because the figures are not showing it. For the past 2 years, we have had less than 6 weeks of available supply. If stocks ever had been as high as the bears in the market want you to believe, prices would not have gone up. This is why we go back to this comment. Prices go down when stocks are low, not when production is low. If we had had this plentiful amount of stocks, prices would not have had a reason to rise this year. Quality, no doubt, no denying. The number one reason for why demand has gone up so much and continues to rise is fantastic demand. Unfortunately, this beautiful reality is not the reality right now in the world of coffee, except in Colombia. I stress there is one significant producer that is actually making progress, and that is very good, especially for the Arabica market, otherwise there would be a serious problem. Central America, Mexico and Peru continue to have massive outbreak of rust. There could be a little bit of a recovery this year in certain countries. Other countries, because there have not been anything or very little done to fight the issue of rust, will continue to see a worsening effect or production flat on what it has been in the last few years. We have 2.8 million people currently in Central America alone on food aid from the World Food Programme because of a drought. We also have a very peculiar situation that although we have drought in the lowlands, the rivers are at the banks and about to burst the banks in the coffee regions because we have had one of the most powerful hurricane seasons in the last 10 years. So at any given time, we could actually see coffee crops being much more severely impacted by the current climate situation, even though at this moment it's not showing up in the figures. Vietnam Initial estimates were for this crop to be between 30 and 32 million bags. It has come down to about between 27 and 28 million bags, and there's no indication that that will improve significantly in the next year. Indonesia has for 3 years battled from the one extreme of drought to the other extreme of excessive rains, and the same ongoing pattern in the same zones. And we are again this year seeing that they are not able to recover, and we will probably in the best case scenario see Indonesia produce about 9 million bags. Brazil, well, that we probably know a bit more about. This is some of the pictures from end of April, where you see what the basic effect of the drought is. Very small bean size, hollow beans, half beans. We saw the 13-14 crop going from an initial forecast of between 58 to 60 million bags to between 40 and 45. Forecast at this point for the next year is currently and mostly between 42 and 47. There are people both more negative. There are those who are more bullish in terms of optimistic forecast. I don't believe any of the extremes in the end of range are actually very realistic. So in terms of the overall balance, we come towards the end here. Well, this is how I see it. I am putting Brazil at 45 for now. We still have to see what will actually happen with the flowering. We still have 2 months ahead. Flowering could come late, flowering could be bad, flowering could recover. If we have better prices, we know that producers are able, and especially in Brazil, they are able to respond, also making better investments and giving higher inputs. That could curb some of the effect of drought, even if the situation currently is still very dry. But we have to still wait another few months before we get a better impression of that. What are some of the other issues? Vietnam, I see relatively stable. Colombia could go up a little bit. Indonesia is definitely going down from last year. Ethiopia stable. India, not as high as a lot of other people are saying. I don't believe we are going to be able to get to more than 4.8 million bags, by the simple reason that they had a terrible late rain. I was there during the main rainy season in March, and 30 to 40% of these flowering in these regions were already lost when I was there. There could have been some recovery, but not enough to get back over 5 million bags. Peru, slight recovery. Uganda, Mexico, definitely not going to be higher, even though some like to believe that, by one simple reason. Last year we had rust coming in primarily in Chiapas, the main growing state in Mexico, but we still did not have rust in Veracruz. This year we have rust in Veracruz. It is highly unlikely that we're going to be able to see production suddenly go up with increased impact of rust across the country. Guatemala, Ivory Coast, more or less stable. We have some countries, I have included them, even though they're not huge. They are in the top 20, 25 of countries. Cameroon had a terrible crop last year, only about 300,000 bags. This is a country that has produced around 1 million bags, or even more, in previous years. If they have a recovery this year, we could have a couple of 100,000 bags more from Cameroon. El Salvador has had the worst crop in 50 years, the smallest crop. It's very hard to see them making a recovery bigger than 100 or 200,000 bags. Again, of course it's possible. It's still very early days. We are still just about to start harvesting. When I look at a couple of the forecasts from other people, we're actually pretty close this year compared to some others. USDA still has it at 148.7 million bags, but that includes a Brazil forecast for 49 million bags, which I absolutely entirely cannot see happening. USDA also has a peculiar figure in production for Malaysia, which I would really love to see where they have, of Malaysia producing 1.6 million bags. So if we take that down, then we'll come a lot closer to the rest of the range. And then we just heard from our colleagues at Rabobank that they're actually pretty much around the same level as I am. ICO has not come out with a forecast yet. They had 145.2 for last year, but that is also based on estimates and forecasts going all the way back to January, February, and have yet to be adjusted. What are some of the potential crop spoilers? We have a lot of places where the crop could be lower. We have very few where it could be higher. Indonesia the rain situation and excessive rains could definitely cause the crop to go down to 7.5 million bags. Brazil, if the flowering comes through, could give us a couple of million more bags. Cameroon could not recover. Thailand could not recover. India could go both ways. It could be both lower and higher. Ivory Coast could be both lower and higher. Central America, Mexico, definitely a potential for a lower crop. We still have to see what would actually be the final effects of the rust issue. Colombia could be lower because of one primary reason, and that is they have not yet had the flowering for the mitaka, the mid-crop. The flowering is not going to start until October, November. If we have an El Niño in December, January in Colombia, we know with almost certainty it will be impossible for the mitaka to flower at 100%. So there's still uncertainty about that. Overall, there will probably be a relative make-up for lower figures by higher figures. But again, we have a lot of countries like Cameroon and Thailand that are all around the 550, 600,000 bags level. It may not sound like a lot, but 100,000 or 200,000 bags from each of those could suddenly make up for difference between 1 or 2 million bags. And with the current deficit, that suddenly has a whole different interest. So, conclusion? Yes, the world is running out of coffee, and it's running out much faster than we would like to believe. I also presented some of these figures 2 years ago. At that time, everybody told me I was absolutely insane and ridiculous and irresponsible to how could I even possibly contemplate such a scenario. Well, the crisis has shown me this year that I was not that far from the truth. Now, looking at these figures again, the pink elephant in the room, we haven't even mentioned China yet. What is going on with China? Some of the latest figures indicate that we could see production in China already close to about 2 million bags, maybe even higher. I believe consumption in China at the moment is at about 3, possibly up to 3.5 million bags. I think China needs to start to be included in global figures. There's not going to be a significant difference in terms of how the supply-demand balance is, because whatever they produce that is not included in the global figures is also what they consume themselves. But it is starting to be of such significant importance that we need to take that into account. Where is all that coffee going to come from? And that's one of the last questions to you today that I would like you to ask to consider. If we look at a massive Marshall Plan for reactivating coffee, we could definitely get to about 36 million bags of new coffee in the next 10 to 15 years. That is a massive effort. Yes, it's possible. Do I think it's realistic? Oh, that would depend on a lot of things. Right now it's not, because right now there's no support actually looking at that. But it certainly is possible. What I do believe we need is to acknowledge that producers are not in a position to take the steps needed to recover and reactivate their crops. What we do have, and it's not about charity, it's about how do we secure the future supply, and how do we make sure that this wonderful, amazing, stunning growth that we've had the last 10, 15 years won't go lost because we suddenly can't come up with the coffee. That would really be very sad. So we need to make sure that we have a plan that addresses social development in parallel with the economics of coffee production. The funding for this is actually already there, but it needs bold vision, and it needs for the coffee industry to connect to world leaders at the World Bank, USDA, USAID, Inter-American Development Bank, the big multinational international lending institutions. We have billions of dollars already approved for infrastructure projects, health and education projects that are desperately needed in the coffee regions more than any other developing countries. The money is just lying around. We need somebody to speed up these funds so we can start creating all the alternative jobs needed to make the coffee industry sustainable long term. It is perfectly possible, but it needs us to connect to some of the political issues that are not always very well connected with coffee. So, I know that Carlos will be talking a lot more and have much more insights on the long-term development, but for the fun of it, I have been working on a supply curve and demand curve going up to 2050, and even looking at specifics of different markets, what is really going on in China, how long, what rate of growth can we expect in these different countries based on cultural, geographical, ethnic mixes. Well, we could definitely get to a point where we have coffee demand at over 300 million bags. Current land cultivated coffee, even if we take out 20%, has the potential to produce 400 million bags, and we're not talking about intensive farming at all, we're talking about very sustainable practices. And all of that would give us a very sustainable coffee industry. But we need to start working on putting some of the policies in place for that to happen now, and not wait another 5 or 10 years until the next crisis will come along, which will be even worse. So with that, I will wrap up, but with one final comment, that is to remember that even when we have had overproduction, and the producers are the ones producing that, as the producers also right now are the ones who have not invested in the farms. Without any single of these millions of producers, we wouldn't have this $100 to $110 billion coffee industry that we are all a part of. So I want to say thanks to the producers and thanks for your attention.
Thank you.
We'll take a few questions. Yes, please.
I want to thank Maja for focusing on the producer and his reality. And of course, I see the great need for a Marshall Plan, and I would go beyond that. But for a sense of urgency on the side of the importing countries, but also on the industry itself, because the coffee culture actually is about hundreds of millions of jobs in the developing countries. And we just need to think that if we don't take action in the next few months, we are going to face a lot more problems on the supply side, but also on the sustainability of the coffee culture, which has developed so well in the last 20 years. Thank you so much. Bye.
Other questions? Please.
You mentioned that the production can go up and it's possible to reach 400 million bags, and do you think certification would have a role to play in contributing to increasing the yields? And what role?
Wow, that is a very interesting question. It also is one that I think would need a lot more debate and time to go properly through. But in short, no, I don't think so. I think certification at many levels are overrated. I think certification has a lot of limits. And in terms of actually getting the coffee out, you need to understand and make producers understand and work with them to make coffee and producers entrepreneurs. And they're not going to become entrepreneurs with a lot of certification programs. I would love to talk more about that, but that would be a very basic summary conclusion.
Other questions?
I'm happy to take more questions later also.
Yes, and we'll be available at the reception and such. I'd like to introduce you to Carlos Brando. He's the director